UConn, Creighton, and Marquette seem to have a stranglehold atop the Big East. Is anybody going to spoil the party?
You are Locked On College Basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, folks? Happy Friday, and welcome into the Locked On College Basketball Podcast, a daily national college hoop show, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We are your co-hosts here for this Friday edition of the show. I'm Andy Patton. He is Isaac Shade, and you are joining us at the place to get your college basketball content Monday through Friday, 5 days a week, 52 weeks out of the year. We're here for you, talking college basketball all the time.
That's a lot of weeks, Andy. That's a lot of weeks.
There's a lot of weeks out there. Yeah, it is all summer long when there's not a lot of action. But, folks, we are in October now. So excited to be really, really close to the start of the college basketball season. I want to give a special shout out to those everyday listeners who were with us throughout the entire offseason, especially those of you who have joined our Locked On College Basketball Discord channel. If you haven't done so yet, it's free to join. There's a link in the show notes on audio and video platforms. You can come hang out with us for the start of the season as we get going here in just a couple of weeks. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Folks, place your first $5 bet and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Just visit FanDuel.com to get started. Well, Isaac, we know that the college basketball season is coming up because we are talking Big East hoops today. So excited to get into our conference preview for the Big East, one of the best, one of the most fun college basketball conferences to talk about year in and year out. Obviously got a lot of conversation about UConn, the back-to-back national champions. We'll talk about them. We'll talk about some other changes at the top. If there's anybody that's going to sneak into that top three that's traditionally or historically the last couple of years been dominated by UConn, Creighton, and Marquette. We'll talk about Rick Pitino and St. John's. We'll give you some award predictions, who's going to make the All-Big East team, who's going to win Big East Player of the Year. Then we'll end the show, talk about how many of these teams are going to go dancing and whether UConn's going to end up winning the Big East and potentially the national championship once again, entering the third straight season potentially for Danny Hurley's club. All right, let's start there. Let's start there because I don't think you can start a conversation talking about the Big East and their storylines without talking about the fact that Dan Hurley and UConn have the potential to do something this upcoming season that hasn't been done since UCLA in the 1970s, which is win a third straight national championship. I know you and Mark Zanetto, the host of Locked On UConn, talked about this extensively on a team preview episode talking about UConn. For those of you who missed it, it's back in your feed. Fantastic stuff there. But the main question coming out of the Big East is, if it's not UConn, who is it going to be? Can somebody challenge UConn in the regular season? Can somebody win this conference that's not Danny Hurley's team? They only got one of their 5 starters returning from last year, but there's a lot of great players who have been in this system who are going to step up into bigger roles. It should still be a great year for Dan Hurley and the Huskies, but is anybody potentially going to be able to unseat them in this conference?
Yep, Syracuse.
Oh, if only. I wish Syracuse was back in the Big East, baby. I do.
No, Andy, I'm just kidding. It's clearly, for me, the team that it's got to be, without a doubt, DePaul. I mean, I'm done with my string of jokes here. For me, Andy, I think it's got to come down to St. John's. And I feel like we both are probably in that boat, but I don't know. For me, like, I think Xavier has maybe a conversation there. But I just think both from a talent standpoint and what's that coach's name again? What's their head coach's name at St. John's?
Pitino? Some guy like named Pitino. Yeah, I think he's been in the Big East before, I think.
Oh, yes. Oh, that's right. Rick Pitino, one of the best college basketball coaches to ever do it. So, of course, it's St. John's. If anyone's going to hop in, it's going to be them. And I just don't, frankly, Andy, see another defensible answer other than St. John's outside of that top 3. What about you?
Yeah, I'm in that same boat. I think Xavier's the next closest, a team that had some serious injury issues last year. Sean Miller's a fantastic coach, particularly on the offensive side of the ball. And we saw a team last year that was just ravaged by injuries. Guys are healthy this year, got some of the key pieces back. I think they're going to be better, but they were 8th last year. The odds of them moving from 8th to top 3, maybe it could happen. I have them in the top 5. I think they're going to make a jump, but more than likely, if anybody's going to unseat those top 3 teams in UConn, Creighton, and Marquette, it's going to be Rick Pitino and the Johnnies. We've seen year 2 under Coach Pitino at previous stops has almost always been wildly successful. This is a roster with, adding Kadari Richmond and Devin Smith from the transfer portal, adding Aaron Scott from North Texas. You expect some performance jumps from guys like RJ Lewis and Simeon Wilcher. Like, I think this is a team that's going to be very, very good. And if they can kind of not have those lull periods that they had at times last year, I expect this to be a program that absolutely contends for a top 3 spot in this conference. In fact, I'll tease this now. I have them in the top 3 of the Big East. I have them unseating one of these 3 teams, in the conference. But yeah, we've really seen the strength of this UConn, Creighton, Marquette kind of triumvirate over the last couple of years. And one of the main things that's noticeable about that being the big 3 in the Big East is who's not there. The Villanova Wildcats, who haven't been in that conversation for the last couple of years since the legendary Jay Wright retired. And Kyle Neptune has been unable to keep this team in that conversation, has been unable to make the NCAA tournament in his first couple of years at the helm. And I think one of the other big storylines and big questions around the Big East this year is, how many more chances is Kyle Neptune going to get? Because if this team, which I'm not super confident that they're an NCAA tournament team, I think they could be. I think they have some talent. I think they're very fortunate they were able to land Wooga Poplar so late in the transfer portal and get Eric Dixon back. Those 2 guys is a good enough core to potentially make some noise. But if they finish 6th in the Big East or somewhere in that area and they don't make the big dance, I'm not sure Kyle Neptune's their head coach the following season.
No, I agree, because in this day and age of the transfer portal, especially this offseason, while we still had 5th-year COVID guys, I don't think it's a defensible argument to say, well, we're still in rebuilding mode. You just, that's not an excuse anymore, Andy, unfortunately. Are there guys in programs that might be learning and growing? Absolutely.
Sure.
But that's at the micro level. At the macro level, you've got to be able to do it and piece together a team year after year after year. Yes, it's still about building programs, but in this day and age, it is so much more professionalized, like free agency that we have in basketball and baseball and NFL, that you've just got to be able to pull it off. And so I know that Villanova has had some injury concerns that have played into this the past couple of years, but man, I think this is it if Nova doesn't do it. Now, as you said, I think Dixon and Poplar is a great core to build around, but other guys are going to have to pop. It cannot just be that twosome, because Andy, I don't know if you know this, but that only makes up 40% of the dudes you put on the floor at one time. Yeah. And that's frankly not enough, because I can defensively scheme against that every day of the week.
One of the other things that we want to talk about here is the interesting kind of dichotomy between the fact that, according to KenPom's data, the Big East was the 2nd best conference in college basketball last year. You would expect a conference that was ranked that highly to have more than 3 teams in the NCAA tournament, but the Big East only got 3 teams. We know which 3. We've been talking about them extensively. UConn, Creighton, Marquette, they made the tournament. 5 teams from the Big East made the NIT. So clearly there was a lot of perceived value in the conference top to bottom, and that's 8 of the 11 teams that were playing in either the NCAA tournament or the NIT, but 5 of them being in the NIT, only 3 of them making the big dance. Like, that's the lowest number we've seen since the realignment in 2013. Seton Hall won the NIT. I think there's a strong argument, not just because they won it, but there's a strong argument that they should have been in the NCAA tournament. I know St. John's felt strongly like they should have been in the tournament last year. Injuries really impacted Providence with Bryce Hopkins going down. I think they could have made it otherwise. So there's some factors. We talked about Villanova already, but I think a big part of the equation for the Big East this year is it's got to be more than 3. It's got to be more than 3. If they only get 3 again this year, even if it's because of snubs, that's not good enough for this conference. And I'm curious to see which teams will step up, which teams will break that trend, how many more teams, if it is more than 3, will end up dancing this year out of the Big East.
And it's so interesting because conference commissioners are having these conversations and having studies done about how do we schedule more wisely and shrewdly that helps our net standing and all our metrics and things like that. And so very curious to see what happens with the Big East in this way. And Andy, in terms of the makeup, here's what's interesting. This kind of hit us as we were preparing for this show. We've had so much shakeup and tumult, I like that word, in the landscape, especially at the power Six conference level, that maybe we forget that the Big East is sitting here with the exact same 11 schools they had last year. ACC adds SMU, Cal, Stanford. Big 12 loses Texas and Oklahoma, adds Arizona, Arizona State, Colorado, Utah. Big 10 adds UCLA, USC, Oregon, and Washington. SEC adds Texas and Utah. Pac-12, they are dormant right now. They will exist again in 2 years, but it's gone. The Big East is literally the only of the six Power Six basketball conferences to look exactly like it did last year. And that's just an interesting facet. Andy, what do you think has played into that happening?
Very quickly, I didn't want to interrupt you, but I think you said Utah instead of Oklahoma, and I pictured Utah joining the SEC, and that's hilarious in my head. So I just wanted to point that out very quickly, folks. Oklahoma is the team that joined the SEC.
Wait, Utah didn't join the? No, that's hilarious.
Honestly, from a football perspective, would be kind of entertaining. But yeah, I mean, they're
just flying through those teams, and undoubtedly, I was going to say one of it wrong. That's so good. I love it.
I love it too. No, it's interesting. Yeah, the Big East, obviously a conference that people have written obituaries for multiple times in the past, and yet it's still here, and it's still kicking, and it's still alive and well. Again, the tournament performance last year in terms of volume of teams was not as expected, but they've now won each of the last two national championships, obviously very successful there. And this is not just a singularly dominated conference by UConn, like Creighton and Marquette were both top 3 seeds, and I think this year we're expecting even more teams. So I don't see a prominent reason for the Big East to make a move yet, but they're obviously keeping a very close eye on what's going on with UConn, and UConn is, attempting to get in the Big 12, and we'll see what happens with the ACC. I think there's a lot of kind of balls in the air that could cause the Big East to make some changes, but they're pretty content where they are. They just got this new media rights deal. It's a 6-year deal, goes through 2030, 2031. I was announced in June. They're continuing to work with NBC, or they're going to continue with Fox. They're also adding NBC and TNT, Peacock, like Max. They got a bunch of different irons in the fire for this upcoming season. I think it's going to be a really productive media deal for the Big East. But yeah, 6 years from now in 2031, when this deal's up, I don't know if it's going to be the same 11 teams. I don't know if it's going to be more. I don't know if it's going to be less. That would be pretty tenuous for the conference if they find themselves in that situation. But this is a great pure basketball league that is fantastic and fun to watch. Yep. And I hope we don't see too many dramatic changes. But obviously they have to do what they need to do to survive. And if they think they're going to lose UConn, they got to go make a move.
Yeah. And I mean, just even from a number standpoint, I just love having 11 because it fits perfectly for a true round robin 20-game conference slate. And so even from that standpoint, I'd love to see it stay the same. Unfortunately, recent history teaches us that if you asked me to put money on it, I would say that it wouldn't be the same makeup in 6 years. And frankly, Andy, that continues to make me very, very sad. Look, lots more to get to, but we need to get to our conference superlatives. Seems, Andy, like it's probably going to be a pretty chalky all Big East team, but who knows? There might be some surprises that slide into this thing. We're going to get into that and the rest of our conference superlatives all coming up in just a second. Right after I tell you about our brand new partner, ZBiotics, which is a pre-alcohol probiotic drink and is the world's first genetically engineered probiotic. It was invented by PhD scientists to tackle rough mornings after drinking. Here's how it works. When you drink, alcohol gets converted into a toxic byproduct in your gut. It's this byproduct, not dehydration, that's to blame for your rough day the next day. Pre-alcohol introduces an enzyme to break down that byproduct. Just remember to make ZBiotics your first drink of the night. Drink responsibly and you'll feel your best tomorrow. Here's how it works. Step 1, drink pre-alcohol for best results. Make it your first drink. Step 2, drink responsibly. Pace yourself, hydrate, and get a good night's sleep. Yeah, right? Step 3, Andy, enjoy tomorrow. Wake up feeling refreshed and ready to take on the day. So go to zbiotics.com/lockedoncollege to learn more and get 15% off your first order when you use Locked On College at checkout. ZBiotics is backed with a 100% money back guarantee. So if you are unsatisfied for any reason, they'll refund your money, 0 questions asked. So again, remember to head to zbiotics.com/lockedoncollege and use code LockedOnCollege at checkout for 15% off.
Today's episode is also brought to you by FanDuel. NFL fans, you can start the season with a huge return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, when you get a hunch in the middle of a game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more, all on the same page where you place your bets. And you get started right now with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. Let's take a look at how FanDuel's odds line up for the Big East regular season champion. And of course, we're going to talk about our predictions for that later in the show. But as of today, UConn has the highest odds at plus 125, followed by Creighton at plus 380, St. John's at plus 550, Marquette at plus 600. So not the top three that we're used to seeing. And then finally, Xavier comes in next at plus 700. If you like those odds, any other odds on FanDuel right now, go check them out. FanDuel.com. America's #1 sportsbook. All right, Isaac, continuing our Big East Conference preview here. We talked about some of the major storylines in the conference. If anybody can unseat that big three of UConn, Creighton, and Marquette. Talked a little bit about the media deal and what's going on with this 11-team conference. But now we want to take a look at our projections for this upcoming season, including we're each going to do a 5-person all Big East team, as we've done these with all of our conference previews. We're only taking players from different teams. So we're not going to do 2 different players from UConn or 2 different players from Marquette or 2 different players from DePaul. We're definitely not going to do that.
Thank you for making the joke, Andy. It had to be done. Yes.
Then we'll also talk player of the year, transfer of the year, freshman of the year, defensive player of the year, and coach of the year. 5 teams or 5 players for our all first team. We're not doing any of those long 10-team teams, especially in a conference like this where we would have to do 1 player from each team. Isaac, I'm going to let you start and read off your first team with the acknowledgement that, folks, I'm just going to tell you right now, mine's going to look pretty darn similar. It felt like there wasn't a lot of different options to go with for our Big East first team.
Yeah, and Andy, I think that is one of the storylines of this thing. Is it there is a pretty clear and obvious, at least on paper, coming into the season, because this is sure to be wacky by the time it all gets said and done. Sure. But there's a pretty clear-cut group that would be at the top with maybe a couple variables and possibilities here. And you know, this is our 4th of our Power 5 conferences, and this was definitely the easiest one to put together for me. And so as I started to look at it, the first person that I put on was not Alex Caravan of UConn, but Kalkbrenner, Ryan Kalkbrenner from Creighton. Was like, I just felt like he has the highest floor of any of these players just because of his size and his both ends of the floor capability. So Ryan Kalkbrenner. I've also got Marquette's Cam Jones. I think he's going to be the straw that stirs the Marquette drink this year. And then look, how can you pick anybody but Alex Caravan from UConn? And again, somebody else could pop, but he's the no-brainer for that. After that, kind of top 3 again, for me, it's got to be about Kadary Richmond coming over from Seton Hall to St. John's. I think I don't have him as my conference player of the year, but I could see him being somebody that could leap up into that. And then 5th for me is somebody whose game I really liked, that I was really glad we mentioned him earlier in the show, that is Eric Dixon at Villanova. And I guess I did, you know, I talked about how kind of obvious it is. I did go back and forth with him and Wooga Poplar a bit, but landed on Dixon. Andy, how much of that is in alignment with your team?
Yeah, 4 of the same 5. And I think most people are going to be able to predict which 4. I think 3 are extremely obvious. It would be, frankly, malpractice to not project Ryan Kalkbrenner, Alex Caravan, and Cam Jones for the first team. I mean, they're just the clear-cut picks. Kalkbrenner's been in this conference for 15 years and has been dominating since Greg McDermott took over as the head coach of this program. It feels like he's been there for so long. Caravan is the clear choice for UConn. Again, it does mean that there won't be an Aiden Mahaney pop or Liam McNeely, even as a freshman, or some of the other guys who could step up. But Caravan is the pick right now. Cam Jones has a clear path to being potentially the player of the year in this conference and a legitimate contender to be a first-team All-American this year at Marquette. I also did go with Kadary Richmond. I think the first 3 are the obvious ones. Richmond is maybe a little less obvious, but this is a guy who dominated last year at Seton Hall. He's going to be in a system that really fits his skill set for Pitino and the Johnnies. I think he's going to put up huge numbers once again for the Red Storm, and I think he's going to be in this conversation. And then my only difference, I considered Eric Dixon. I considered Wooga Poplar. I considered even some farther down in the standings teams who have some players that might pop, but ultimately ended up going with Bryce Hopkins at Providence.
That's a good call.
Health is the question there for him, obviously, but
sure.
tremendously talented last year. When he went down, we saw Devin Carter step up in a massive way for Providence. I think Kim English can really get a lot out of versatile players like Hopkins, like Carter. And if Hopkins is healthy for the full season, I think he's going to put up numbers capable of putting himself in this conversation.
Yeah, Andy, and I think that's so wisely said because of Hopkins' injury last year and because of Carter going off after that, I think some people might have just kind of put Hopkins on the back burner of their mind. And let's not forget what a phenomenal basketball player he is, as you said, if healthy. Also, I hadn't thought about this until you were talking about Kadary Richmond. I want to think back to a previous player for Rick Pitino at a different school, and that's Russ Smith, just going off at Louisville. Like, as you talked about him fitting in with a Rick Pitino system, it's like that kind of thing where for me, it was always like, let Russ cook. Well, we could see that with Kadary Richmond this year. Andy, that said, who is your Big East player of the year out of that 5?
I went with Cam Jones. I think Cam Jones is in the right situation where he's on a team where he's going to have a super high usage rate. I think you look at Marquette's roster in the absence of Kolek and the absence of Oso Ighodaro, who are both in the NBA. And Oso took like 10 2-point attempts per game last year. Kolek obviously distributed the basketball a bunch. And you have those two guys are gone. And you're going to have some guys step up. We're going to see Stevie Mitchell and Chase Ross and Ben Gold and guys like that step into bigger roles. But Cam Jones is going to have the ball a ton. And on a roster that I think is going to space the floor significantly without having a low post player like Oso in the mix, I think that gives Cam Jones room to operate, to get to the basket, to put pressure on the rim, to get in isolation situations. I think he's going to put up big numbers for a Marquette team that I don't know if they're going to be as good as last year, but I think they're going to be very good. And I think good enough that if Cam Jones is the most productive player on one of the 3, 4, 5 best teams in the Big East, that's enough for him to win this award. Yeah,
Andy, I think I wouldn't be surprised if when we get to Big East Media Day, which is still a couple weeks away, it's going to be Caravan that wins. That is given this preseason Player of the Year award. Neither of us are picking him. I'm going to go with Ryan Kalkbrenner of Creighton. I have begged and pleaded with Greg McDermott and this team to utilize him more on offense because he's such a highly efficient player. The defense is there, right? Like there's you can't, because he doesn't have to get the ball to be effective there. Although he does get the ball a lot on defense, I'll say. But I think part of it for me is when you think about Baylor Shireman being gone and Trey Alexander being gone, I think they will likely utilize him more offensively. And if he can do even, 15 to 20% more offensively in terms of his usage, then I think what he already does defensively combined with that gives him Player of the Year numbers, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Andy, what about transfer of the year for this conference?
I think you got to go Richmond. You got to go Richmond. And I considered Wooga Poplar, who we talked about already. I considered Malik Mack, transfer from Harvard, who's at Georgetown. I think he's going to be fantastic for Ed Cooley and the Hoyas. But if this was a real award, and I don't think the Big East does specific transfer of the year, it would be stunning if it's not, at least a preseason projection, if it's not Kadary Richmond. Obviously, we'll see what happens in the season, but he's tailor-made for this kind of award. He's going to be fantastic this year.
Well, and by definition of the 6 combined players we put on our first team, I think he was the only transfer, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Which that in itself is very interesting. Way to go, Big East. Lots of returning great talent. I hadn't even picked up on that until I was mentioning this. Andy, similarly, in the freshman of the year category, there are other freshmen that are going to get some shine, but I think there's only one logical answer here, and I'm imagining that it's who we both went with, and that's UConn's Liam McNeely.
Yeah, I looked for other candidates to chat, like not just because I was anti-picking Liam McNeely. I was just like, I want to make sure I'm not missing anybody. And like,
yes,
there's some freshmen out there who are going to play some minutes. I'm sure some guys who aren't getting projected to play as much as they will ultimately end up playing. But Liam McNeely is the clear option. He's got a role. He's in a system that's going to tailor-made to his skill set. He's going to play right away. This award, there's a real chance that it's not even close in terms of who ends up being the most productive freshman in the Big East this year.
Yeah. And look, I know we've already had a lot of agreement, but I think the same is going to be true of our defensive player of the year. And we've already just talked about him a little bit, but who is it, Andy?
Yeah, it would be, again, I mentioned the malpractice comment earlier. If you project anybody other than Ryan Kalkbrenner to win defensive player of the year, the man has already won it 3 times. He is literally already a 3-time Big East defensive player of the year. Like you can't not pick him to win this award again. He's a shot blocking machine, fantastic rebounder. He's your guy. And with apologies to Kadary Richmond, who's also a phenomenal defensive player. I'm sure there are many other great defensive players in this conference, but this has got to go to Kalkbrenner.
Yeah, absolutely. Could be a 4-time straight Big East Defensive Player of the Year. That's insane, but for good reason. All right, Andy, hopefully we'll get some disagreement on Coach of the Year, although I'm not apologizing for our agreement in the previous ones. It just makes sense. Who did you go with for your B-Coy?
I had two coaches that I was strongly considering. I ultimately went with Rick Pitino. I was hesitant on him only because I'm not sure if he would actually win the award just for St. John's moving up to third in the standings. If they finish second or certainly first, I think he's a very obvious winner. But if they just finish third and make the tournament, I'm not sure that's going to, what if he does that and some of the other coaches move from seventh to fifth or seventh to fourth or whatever, you know what I mean? I'm not sure if they'll give Pitino the award, but I think he should get it if this St. John's team does what I think they're capable of doing, which is consistently find themselves ranked inside the top 25, in the top 3 of this conference, contending for a top 2 spot, genuinely challenging UConn at the top of the conference. If St. John's does that, then I think Pitino should be your winner.
Andy, if Rick Pitino wins it, how many different conferences will he have won a Coach of the Year in?
3. Would this be his third different, because has he already won in the Big East?
He's not. No,
he has not won in the Big East.
No, twice in the SEC, 91 and 96.
Yeah, and he won in the ACC with, or he won in the AAC with Louisville, right?
Conference USA.
Oh, that's right. It's Conference USA
in 2005. Yeah,
and then did he win it at Iona?
He did twice in the MAC 2022
so
and 23.
4th different conference.
So
his first time winning Big East Coach of the Year.
That's right.
That's hilarious.
How about that? I know. I was really curious, so I just looked that up while you were talking. Andy, who was the other coach you were struggling with? Because I wonder if it's who I picked for mine.
The other coach I was struggling with, I didn't have time to look up if he's won Coach of the Year in a previous conference, but I think he probably has. That's Sean Miller.
Yes. And so of the two guys Andy was deciding between, I went the other way. I did pick Sean Miller because, as we were talking about earlier, we think Xavier can hop up along with St. John's into kind of this top 2, maybe top 2 tiers, top 5 teams in the Big East. Last year, Xavier was 8th. I kind of have Xavier 5th. But if they could get into that top 3, if they could upset that triumvirate that Andy was calling it earlier, which I love, then I think Sean Miller might be your guy, especially just knowing the things he's kind of been through in his coaching career. That I think there would be some sympathy for that. And man, let's give Sean this award. So I think that's where it would go.
For the record, it would be his 3rd different conference winning Coach of the Year award if he were to do it. He won it in the A10 at Xavier previously, and then he won it in the Pac-12, of course, 3 times with Arizona. So potential options to see some coaches winning this award for multiple different times in multiple different conferences if either of them take it home. Isaac, main question here, one of the big questions we've had about the Big East, we're going to answer it here to close out the show. Are they going to get more than 3 teams in the Big Dance? They probably deserve to have more than 3 teams last year. Is that going to be the situation we find themselves in 2025? We're also going to take a look at a tier list of the 11 teams in this conference, how that might shake out this upcoming season, all coming up in just a second. Right after I tell you about Robinhood. Folks, with Robinhood Gold, you don't need a silver spoon to eat up the financial favors of the 1%. Robinhood Gold allows others to get the rates and perks usually reserved for the high society. Now the resourceful individual with Robinhood Gold can earn the very liberal rate of 4.5% APY on uninvested cash, receive unlimited 1% deposit bonuses, and be rewarded with a handsome 3% retirement boost on an IRA account. Robinhood Gold provides the privileges of a high net worth for any net worth. These generous benefits are now available for only $5 a month. The new gold standard is here with Robinhood Gold. Sign up now at robinhood.com/gold. Terms do apply. For product-specific disclosures, visit robinhood.com/gold. Investing always involves risk. Rate may change. Gold membership is offered by Robinhood Gold, LLC. All right, Isaac, closing out our Big East Conference preview here, taking a look at a tier list. We broke up the 11 teams into 4 different tiers. We're going to talk about that, talk a little bit about some of the coaching changes, and then make our predictions for who's going to win the regular season, who's going to win that conference tournament at the Madison Square Garden, and then how many of these teams are going to be dancing in the 2025 NCAA tournament. We'll start with the tier list. And for the first time, we've spent this whole show talking about how there is a top 3 in the Big East. And yet here we go, finally getting to the actual part of the show where we break up the teams into tiers. And I don't have the top 3 teams in the top tier. I only have 2 teams in the top tier, UConn and Creighton in that top tier, with tier 2 in this order, which I know is probably going to surprise some people. St. John's at 3, Xavier at 4, Marquette at 5. All of those teams in that second tier. So that's Isaac, I'm curious your thoughts as we kind of look at trying to break up those. I think we generally agree on the consensus of those being the top 5 teams.
5, yeah.
But I'm curious where you thought that break should be and maybe what order you think they should be in.
Man, it's tough with Marquette. I do think they're below Creighton, but I would personally still have them above St. John's and Xavier. But I'm trying to think from a tier standpoint. Does that make sense? I'm trying, like, I don't know if I would more closely align them with Creighton and UConn or with St. John's and Xavier, and if I would more closely align Creighton even with UConn, because I could also make an argument for a 5th tier, UConn in tier 1, and then Creighton and Marquette in tier 2, St. John's and Xavier in tier 3. And obviously that's just semantics, because as you said, we're clearly aligned on the top 5. And so I think, I think ultimately I'd put Marquette a little bit closer to Creighton, but gosh, yeah, that's tough, Andy.
It's tough. It's a projection based on you're making assumptions that Xavier's going to be healthy and that's certain things are going to happen there, and you're making the assumption that St. John's the backcourt's going to be fluid, and it's obviously you have confidence in Rick Pitino, but for Marquette it's like they didn't add anybody and they lost 2 NBA players, and I think that fact alone is enough to kind of raise some eyebrows. But Shaka Smart, he's done this before. Like, this is not new for this program, and they've had tons of success. And I think you think about guys like Ross and Mitchell and Ben Gold, like we mentioned, and David Joplin, who's going to have a big role this year. I think there's a ton of talent on this team, and I think they're going to be very good. I think that there's more excitement for St. John's and Xavier, and I think more upside with those teams. But again, a lot of teams have, or a lot of analysts and media members and stuff have tried to discount Shaka Smart and Marquette in the past, and they are frequently wrong. So I am fully prepared to be incorrect about this, because I would not be the first person that it happened to, but I'm just not quite ready to just automatically assume they're right back in that mix, because I mean, they didn't just lose 2 good players. They lost 2 really, really talented players from last year's roster.
And 2 that made a living utilizing the 2 of them.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? Like the way Kolek and Oso were.
But everybody else in that roster was a 3rd option at best, and now they all have to move up multiple spots.
Exactly. That's the point. So, Andy, into tier, here's, as for the other 6 teams, I think Georgetown and DePaul are clearly lower than everyone else.
Right.
And so whatever the last tiered number is going to be, that's where I would have them. And then Villanova, Providence, Seton Hall, and Butler, none of them really distinguish themselves from the another well enough for me to want to siphon any of that off. So I really like just that quartet in tier 3, and then Georgetown and DePaul in tier 4.
Yeah, I remember 6 through 9 in the Big East last year, kind of like every game would happen. Like Butler would win and they'd go from 7th to, or they go from 8th to 6th in the conference, and then they'd lose and they'd go drop down to 9th. Like, they were all really close last year. So I have little like Seton Hall was better last year, but I have little reason to think that those 4 teams aren't going to kind of be back and forth with each other all season long. And maybe somebody will separate themselves and kind of challenge the top 5. But right now that group feels like they're all kind of solidly in that middle spot.
And Andy, I know we've joked about DePaul a couple of times here today. I really am curious to see how things go with Chris Holtman coming in, the lone coaching change in this conference, which again, consistency of the teams, consistency of who's going to be at the top of the thing, consistency in the coaches, which is really neat. And I don't think it's going to be a big leap for DePaul, but I think they've got to take some kind of step forward, just not enough. But Andy, I realized as I was prepping for this show, 9 of the 11 coaches in the Big East are new to their school since the 2021-22 season. And obviously I'm including Miller and Mata returning to Xavier and Butler respectively. Right. But so interesting to me. So only Danny Hurley and Greg McDermott have been at their schools longer than 2021-22.
That's wild to me. And speaking on the DePaul thing, I'm very interested to see Layden Blocker transfer from Arkansas.
Sure. That's true.
Didn't play very much last year on an Arkansas team that had just a chaos in the backcourt all season long. A fresh start for him, playing for a coach in Holtman who's had success with guards in the past. Like, there's a lot of interesting players on DePaul's roster, and I'm curious to see how it plays out. But Blocker's a guy. If I am watching any DePaul basketball games this year, that's a guy I'm going to be keeping an eye on.
That's fair. Well, Andy, if we expect them to be, unfortunately, at the bottom of the conference yet again, who's going to win this thing? Who's going to be at the top in the regular season standings? Is it UConn by 4 games?
I think it has to be UConn. I think you got to go with UConn. And that's with no disrespect to Creighton, who I think had a tremendous offseason. You lost two great players in Shireman and Trey Alexander, but you replaced them with Pop Isaacs and Jemiah Neal, two Big 12 transfers. Jemiah Neal, sort of a Big 12 transfer coming over from Arizona State. But I like this Creighton roster a lot. I think they're going to be very good, but it doesn't feel right to bet against UConn, even with them losing 4 starters, because I think that's what gets lost in that conversation on the surface level is people say, oh, they lost 4 starters, they're only returning 1 starter back. But they're bringing back Hassan Diarra, who's the 6th man of the year. They're bringing back Samson Johnson. They're bringing back Solomon Ball. They're bringing back Jalen Stewart. Like, they're bringing back players who were in this rotation last year who were valuable pieces. That's what Danny Hurley is great at, is keeping talent, developing talent. When it's their turn to step into a bigger role, they do it. And I realize that this is also true at Marquette, and that's why they've had a lot of success. But Marquette didn't lose 4 starters. They just lost 2. For UConn, they're going to have guys step into those roles. Those guys are going to be valuable pieces right away. And then you add in a top 10 freshman in the country in Liam McNeely. You add in a guard who had a lot of success at St. Mary's and Aiden Mahaney. You add in a big man in Terrace Reed. Like, I don't think there's a strong argument to bet against UConn right now. The only team that I feel confidently could unseat them in the regular season is Creighton. And I'm if given the choice, I'm taking UConn.
And it's so crazy, Andy. Like, we've made such a big deal about the dominance of UConn's back-to-back national championship runs, in the actual tournament, but winning a true home-and-home conference by 4 games last season is insane. So I'm curious to see, for me, it's not about do they win. It's with what degree of severity do they win the Big East regular season. That said, can they bring home back-to-back a Big East tournament championships? Andy, I'm going to say yes. What about you?
I'm going to say Creighton. I'm going to pick Creighton to win the conference tournament. Greg McDermott's a phenomenal coach. Obviously, so is Danny. But I think that Creighton's going to be ready to win that tournament. They got a lot of experience. Kalkbrenner is just such a load to have to deal with in a tournament situation like that. Ashworth's a veteran guy in the backcourt. Like, give me Creighton to win that tournament championship. I think it's going to be between those 2 teams. And boy, if that is a championship game at the Madison Square Garden after they've already faced each other a couple of times, that's going to be must-watch TV. I can promise you that.
It very much will be. Andy, last thing. 3 teams made the NCAA tournament last year. We've talked about it a couple times today already. Can they eclipse that number this time around?
Yeah, I got 5. I got 5 teams making it from the Big East. I think that's probably how many should have made it last year for what it is worth. So maybe there'll be some correction to that this upcoming season. I got the big 3 all back in the triumvirate. As we said earlier, UConn, Creighton, Marquette, all back making the big dance. I think they're all probably going to be single-digit seeds. And then I also got St. John's. I think Rick Pitino is going to be dancing again. Nobody's going to want to face that St. John's team in March. I'm positive of that, but I think that this team is definitely good enough to be dancing. And then give me Xavier for that last spot. I think Xavier is going to sneak in this year. Health is a huge factor for guys like Fremantle and Jerome Hunter. If those guys are healthy, they get Davion McKnight back. Sean Miller's a good coach. I think that combination is enough for them to finish 5th or higher in this conference, and I think to earn themselves a spot in the tournament.
All right, Andy, you know what? I am right there with you. Same numbers, same teams, which makes sense. It's what we've been talking about. It's how our tiers broke down, and so it's not shocking to anyone to hear that. And if you're one of those 6 schools who we don't have in, come at us and let us know why your school should be in and why we're goobers for not doing so. Andy, that's going to wrap it up for another great week. When we're back together next week, it will be just 3 weeks till the tip of the regular season. This thing is coming like a freight train. Buckle up, folks. Sure, the election is the next day, but we're all excited about basketball season. If you're not part of our show already in terms of being subscribed, make sure you do that so you don't miss a second of Locked On College Basketball on both YouTube and audio. If you're not part of the Locked On College Basketball Discord, we'd love to have you in there. It's free to join. The link is in the show notes. As always, apologies to the Lawyer family. Let's go Wildcats, which today would be the Villanova version. And until Monday when we talk again, peace.